Jean Lave is an ethnographer with a background in social anthropology. She received her PhD from Harvard in the late 60s and is currently a professor at UC Berkeley. Her first book in '84 was Everyday Cognition, Its Development in Social Context. Then she wrote Situated Learning, Legitimate Peripheral Participation, which she co-authored with Etienne Wenger in 1991. Wenger now runs a consulting firm that works worldwide to help organizations develop strategic plans in support of communities of practice. He grew up in Switzerland and is a computer scientist by training. When he was getting his advanced degrees in computer science from the University of California at Irvine, he was approached by John Seely Brown. Brown was the founder of the Institute for Research on Learning in Palo Alto, California. The Institute for Research on Learning, or IRL, was a cross-disciplinary think tank where researchers from the fields of anthropology, psychology, education, computer science, and linguistics came together to examine learning in different settings. Since Lave, the anthropologist, and Wenger, the computer scientist, were both at IRL and both interested in social practice theory and the theory of situated activity, they started working together. Their concepts around situated learning and legitimate peripheral participation were explained in their 1991 book. To understand the unlikely mix of an anthropologist and a computer scientist, you have to look at where these two individuals were physically and temporally located. It was Silicon Valley, California in the late 80s and 90s. Computers were king. As John Seely Brown noted in the foreword to Situated Learning, computers and computational media were starting to change the way we acted in the world and the way we communicated. Computers were changing what it meant to know and what it meant to understand. Lave and Wenger wanted a deeper understanding of the situated nature of learning, and they believed that the practices and theories of the time were inept at providing this understanding. At the IRL, they began discussing apprenticeships and realized that the term was so ambiguous it was in danger of becoming meaningless. Lave had examined apprenticeships in West Africa and was interested in their structured patterns of learning and the idea of learning by doing. In an attempt to rescue the idea of apprenticeship, they knew they'd also have to examine situated learning, which was becoming synonymous with the term. Before delving into Lave and Wenger's explanations of situated learning, let's first turn our attention to how they thought of learning. They rejected the concept of learning being located in individual brains, and instead rooted their theory in the belief that learning is located in participation. They balked at the idea that learning was one singular kind of activity. Instead, they saw learning as an aspect in every activity. In addition, they believed that learning had a relational character. They were not fans of abstract representation of knowledge or decontextualized learning. They believed in concrete relations. The irony was that their concepts were pretty abstract and hard to grasp. Pulling on previous works from theorists such as Marx, Hall, and Vygotsky, they needed a concrete way of explaining their new theory. Legitimate peripheral participation was that way. For my tongue's sake, I'm just going to call it LPP. LPP is a nuanced and complicated illustration of situated learning. Lave and Wenger admit that LPP doesn't offer a concise definition with boundaries. Instead, it's explained in relational and interconnected terms. It's a process, it's an analytic perspective, and it's a way of understanding learning. LPP is the process by which newcomers become part of a community and move from peripheral participation to full participation. A newcomer enters a community of practice through her relationships and gains increasing access and responsibility. During this process, learning takes place and the newcomer constructs new identities. Over time and with experience, the newcomer becomes an old-timer. The newcomers and old-timers are always engaged in learning and contributing, and as they do this, each changes, and in the process, their communities of practice change. Now we've got a grasp on LPP, let's talk about communities of practice. Remember that the authors reject the idea of learning being located in the brain. With that, they reject the idea of internalization. Since they felt that learning is located in practice and not internalized, it means that learning is concerned with increasing participation in the community of practice. The concept of community of practice stems from the theory of social practice and is supported by the relational views of that theory. Members of a community of practice don't focus solely on the master craftsperson, but they learn from relationships to all people, all situations, and all contexts that make up the communities of practice. Lave and Wenger don't spend much time describing communities of practice like they do discussing LPP. So we'll leave the concept of community of practice here and turn back to one of the original reasons for interest in the nexus between social practice theory and the theory of situated learning: concern for apprenticeship. Remember that one of the motivations for exploring the theory of learning was to save the concept of apprenticeship. In the book, they discuss stereotypes associated with apprenticeships and critique them. The idea that there's a master craftsperson that imparts knowledge onto an apprentice is not exactly how it works. Instead, what they claim is an initial partial nature of participation. In the beginning, the newcomer experiences only small segments of shared practice. As the newcomer gets closer to full participation, the segments they experience and contribute to increase in scope and complexity. Take, for example, the tailors in Liberia. Newcomers might start with just prepping the materials or sewing buttons to nearly finished garments. By the time they are full participants, they are designing, assembling, and finishing whole suits. So they move from the periphery to full participation, and as they do, their tasks, roles, and functions get more complex. So why bring up tailors? Well, for this discussion, it's important to know what tailors, midwives, quartermasters, and alcoholics all have in common. So what do they have in common? They were all presented in Lave and Wigner's text as examples of apprenticeships. Each provided illustrations that helps us better understand various aspects of apprenticeships, the LPP, and communities of practice. The tailors illustrated ways that curriculum could be laid out as part of everyday practice. Mayan midwives from Mexico exemplified how learning can occur without teaching and without formally organized apprenticeship. Quartermasters in the U.S. Navy showed how information flows in an apprenticeship and how LPP comes to life as a member moves from the periphery to full participation. The discussion on non-drinking members of Alcoholics Anonymous uncovered how talking and telling one's story is a cultural tool of change. Using these different types of apprenticeships to uncover examples of legitimate peripheral participation, the authors were able to further illustrate their theory of situated learning. But recognizing that the text could only cover so much ground, Lave and Wigner were explicit that issues of motivation, identity, and language deserve further discussion. Critics agreed, but more common responses to Lave and Wigner's work included the questioning of their assumptions around the extent to which context drove learning. Anderson, Rutter, and Simon produced an article in the mid-90s that proved to offer popular critiques of situated learning. In it, they claimed that while some learning was context-dependent, a lot of learning was context-independent. They also countered that abstract instruction is useful to learners and shouldn't be abandoned. One of their grounding principles to the theory of situated learning was that it was to be generative, and it's proven to be just that. Both Lave and Wenger have continued to generate ideas related to situated learning. In '98, he published Communities of Practice: Learning, Meaning, and Identity, and in 2002, he released the follow-up, Cultivating Communities of Practice. Communities of practice is now a bit of a generic term. It's commonly used to describe groups of individuals loosely organized who work on similar projects. Within the communities of practice, members exchange ideas and information. Within my small workplace of just a few dozen people, there are 5 different communities of practice. It makes me wonder if there are other anthropologist and computer scientist teams out there concerned about endangered terms. Like the term apprenticeship was in the late 80s, the term communities of practice may also be in danger of becoming meaningless. Thanks for watching this short video on Lave and Wenger's situated learning.